Module 4, Designing Studies. Previously, we learned that the first stage of data production is sampling, that is, determining the portion of the population from which to collect information. The second stage that we're looking at now is designing your study. So there are three main study designs that we'll be considering. The way that a study is designed will determine how the value of the variables are obtained. So the first design is one in which the values of the explanatory variable are assigned by the researcher. This type of a study is called an experiment. So the key to an experiment is that the researcher assigns the values of the explanatory variable to the participants. The next type of study, the values of the explanatory variable are recorded as they naturally occur. This happens in an observational study. Next, the values of the explanatory variable are reported by participants. Okay, well, this is a type of an observational study that's called a sample survey. So we have a sample of the population, they're given a survey, and so the value of the explanatory variables are going to be reported by the participants. So note, as I just mentioned, a sample survey is a type of observational study. It's widely used, so in the Open Learning Initiative, they have it listed as its own design type so that we can look at it in a bit more detail. In this module, we'll explore how study design affects our ability to build evidence of causation. And remember that just because you find that there's an association between an explanatory variable and your response variable, that does not mean that one causes the other. In our first example, a researcher wants to determine whether Apple laptops, we'll refer to them as Macs, or Dell laptops, which we'll refer to as PCs, are more durable. Determine whether the described study design is an experiment, an observational study, or a sample survey. Part A, researchers recruit 100 graduate students who own a Mac or PC laptop that is 3 years old. The researchers test the performance of each computer. Okay, well, let's see. Is it an experiment? No, because the researchers did not assign participants to either of those groups, Mac owners or PC owners. Is it an observational study? Yes, it is. Notice that it is not a sample survey because the participants had not been asked to report values of the explanatory variables themselves. Okay, Part B. Researchers recruit 100 graduate students for their study. They give 50 of the participants new Macs and the other 50 participants new PCs. The researchers will test the performance of each computer in 3 years. So this one will be an experiment because the researchers have assigned half the participants to using a Mac and the other half to using a PC. Part C, researchers recruit 100 graduate students who have owned a Mac or PC laptop in the last 3 years. The participants are given a survey to complete with questions concerning the performance of their computers. Okay, so clearly this is going to be a sample survey because the participants are reporting the value of the variable themselves. Let's go on to the next page. So some more about identifying study types. So we're going to look at 2 additional types of observational studies. So the first type are observational studies in which values of the variable are recorded as they naturally happen forward in time. This is called a prospective observational study. In contrast, an observational study in which values of the variable are recorded after they happen, backward in time, is called a retrospective observational study. So let's look at a couple more examples where I want you to determine whether the study mentioned below is a prospective observational study, a retrospective observational study, a sample survey, or an experiment. Okay, part A. A researcher compares the SAT scores of students who took an SAT prep class and students who did not take a prep class to see if the prep class significantly increased scores. Okay, well, we know that this is not an experiment because the researchers did not assign the students to any particular group. Okay, and if we read this further, we have students who have already taken an SAT prep class and then some who did not, and they're looking back to see if the SAT scores were higher for the ones who did take the prep class. So this is a retrospective study. The researchers are looking at something that's already happened. Part B, researchers want to determine if a new type of protective spray is an effective deterrent from dog attacks. Participants are clothed in protective gear with a container of protective spray and placed in a gated area with an aggressive dog. Okay, well, this looks like it would be a prospective observational study because there's only one type of explanatory variable, and that's this having the spray to see if it's effective against the dog. So the researchers are not assigning participants to two different groups, and they're going to be reporting the results as they happen. So this is prospective. Let's look at part C. Researchers want to determine if joining an online dating service results in more marriages within 1 year. A sample of 500 participants is obtained. Half are assigned to use Dating Pros online, and the other half agree not to use any online dating service. The researchers interview participants in 1 year to determine how many marriages have occurred in each group. Well, this one will be an experiment because the researchers assigned half the participants to a dating site, the other half to not use a dating site. Have our caution again. Remember that an association does not mean causation. With an experiment, there is a better chance to establish causation than with an observational study. Okay, so now we're going to look a little bit further into causation and observational studies. Suppose that a researcher wants to determine if cat owners have less stress than non-cat owners. The researcher recruits participants and records who owns cats and who does not. The participants are then given a written exam designed to determine their stress levels. The researchers found that 95% of cat owners have less stress than their counterparts. Question: can we surmise that owning a cat will decrease one's stress? Explain. Okay, before we answer that question, I want you to look back at the scenario that we're given and notice that this is an observational study. Okay, the researcher recruits participants and records who owns cats and who does not. The researcher does not assign who owns a cat and who does not. Okay, so that tells us we're dealing with an observational study. Okay, well, since 95% of cat owners have less stress than their counterparts that were examined, can we conclude that owning a cat will decrease one's stress? The answer is no. If I give a cat to somebody, despite the results of the study, that can't guarantee that they're going to have less stress, because there are other things that may have been at play with these participants that could have caused some to have a higher stress level than other. And so the reason that it's no is because there are lurking variables that are possible. So lurking variables are possible. That could affect the result. So for example, perhaps the income or the employment status of the participants may affect their stress level, whether they have a cat or not. So employment status. Perhaps the folks who are employed may have had cats. More people who were not employed may not have had cats. So that would be a variable that was not considered as part of the study that could very well affect the results. Another lurking variable could be how long the cat has been owned. If someone's going through litter box training, it's quite probable that they're not going to be as stress-free as someone who has a 10-year-old cat that behaves perfectly. So the point here is that we cannot assume that just because somebody owns a cat that their stress is going to decrease despite the results of the study. So lurking variables are one of the issues when trying to determine causation with an observational study. So there are some ways that we can control for the lurking variable, so that way we can have a study that we can conclude more information from. So our goal is to ensure that the individuals in the study differ only with respect to the explanatory variable. In other words, we want to control for whatever the lurking variable is. So if we think back to that last example with the cat owners, how could we improve the study about owning a cat and stress? And there are a number of things that we can do. We might limit the participants to those who are employed. We might want to limit participants to those who have owned a cat for 5 years or more. So those are just two ways that we can control for some of the lurking variables, so that way we have a more homogeneous group that we're looking at, and fewer variables to explain the result than just owning a cat. Okay, some other issues with observational studies that could come up. With prospective studies, self-reporting can be an issue. Okay, same with the survey. With a retrospective study, someone may have an inaccurate recollection of events, so the results may not be as reliable.